We have done discovery, port scans, enumeration. Now it's time to look for vulnerabilities and to analyze which vulnerabilities are worth trying to attack. So let's talk about vulnerability analysis. We have some goals that you can understand vulnerability research and classification. You can describe vulnerability assessment and the vulnerability management life cycle. You can understand different approaches of vulnerability assessment and describe characteristics of a good vulnerability assessment tool, and choose an appropriate tool and generate reports. So here are the little topics we're going to talk about: vulnerability assessment concepts and solutions, scoring systems, and tools and reports. So let's start with what is a vulnerability assessment. First of all, it is not a penetration test. A vulnerability assessment is looking at weaknesses and getting a list of weaknesses. It doesn't mean those weaknesses are exploitable. And quite frankly, when you use commercial vulnerability scanners, to make themselves look good, they will give you every possible thing they can discover that may or may not have any bearing or relevance on what you're doing. So nonetheless, though, vulnerability scanning is a part of penetration testing. After we have port scanned and enumerated, we want to see the weaknesses of the things and try to match an exploit to the weaknesses. A vulnerability scanner will come up with a huge long list, only some of which will be truly exploitable. So it's up to the ethical hacker to try to pen test and exploit the obvious things. So a vulnerability assessment, this is an examination of a system's ability to withstand attack. We try to identify weaknesses that might be exploited and also to try to predict the effectiveness of our security controls. We can see here's a screen cap of one of the vulnerability scanners called Nexpose, put out by the same people who bring us Metasploit. Anyway, this is their dashboard, so we can see this is like a summary view, and then if we wanted to drill down, we could. In order to stay on top of things, you need to, as a security administrator, as a security professional, as an ethical hacker, stay on top of the latest trends and threats and attacks. So you need to be able to do vulnerability research. You need to be able to discover system design faults and find the weaknesses before the attack, as well as know how to recover from an attack. And vulnerabilities are very typically classified by their priority, their severity, and how widespread or their scope. And so here's one example, just to zoom in on this. This is one site you can go to do research called CVE Details, cvedetails.com. They're really kind of a fun place to go to. You can browse, you can search for specific vulnerabilities. Now, let's pause for a minute. What does CVE stand for? We'll talk about that later, but the short answer is common vulnerabilities and exposures. So we could browse by product, by vendor, by CVE ID. I love this one, the top 50. Go to the top 50 here. And they use the scoring system, which we'll talk about in greater detail in just a second, of not very likely to be very low risk to extremely high risk. And so we can then just browse by the top 50 vendors or search a particular product version vendor or a particular vulnerability. So some places you can go for vulnerability research. Big one, SANS.org, right there, SANS.org. Also, Microsoft has one. There are online magazines. There's Security Focus. There's hacker sites like HackerStorm, Rapid7. There are the antivirus people like Trend Micro. There's CVE Details, Exploit Database, which we saw when we did Google Dorking, Google Hacking there. They also, you can just search to see if exploits even exist, and other places as well. Now, what does it mean to classify vulnerabilities? So there are sort of categories of vulnerabilities. And some categories could be like misconfigurations or defaults that were never changed or potential for buffer overflows or unpatched systems or flat-out design flaws or OS flaws, application flaws, open services. Let me show you what CVE Details does. They have a classification system. They organize it by denial of service, code execution, overflow, be it buffer or heap, memory corruption, which is sort of an overflow in a way, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, directory traversal, HTTP response splitting, bypassing anything, gaining information, so data exfiltration, data leakage, gaining privileges, so privilege escalation, cross-site request forgery, file inclusion, and then they have a summary. And so what they like to do is they'll say for a particular vendor, so like in this case I just looked up Microsoft. For a particular vendor in the years, you can see the number of total vulnerabilities that have been pointed out, and then you can see of that how many were denial of service, how many are code execution, overflows, etc. So this categorization system is what CVE Details does, and they do it across all products, all vendors. So you can see with Microsoft doesn't have a whole lot of SQL products, so that's why we don't see a whole lot of SQL injection here. That is just one example. Now, how do you do vulnerability assessment? You could just sit and watch. You could put a sniffer on a network and just observe and see how the protocols are talking back and forth and figure out something there. Or, if you want to get far more information, but you are going to be intrusive, you could actively scan. You could use a tool that sends specialized packets with specialized crafted requests to target systems to see how they react. Here's the limits of a vulnerability assessment. If you use an automated tool, like all the scanners that we have, they only look for known signatures. Vulnerability scanners cannot look for zero-day exploits. They can't look for things they don't know. They can't look for non-technical things. They can't check for, are people susceptible to social engineering? And the software vulnerability scanners certainly cannot check for like possible physical points of entry. They can only look for what they know, and that's one of the risks. So that's why vulnerability scanning is not the be-all and end-all. However, it has an excellent place in pen testing, and if you are an administrator, you should do a vulnerability scan regularly, like every month, to see if anything new pops up, which means your scanner has to keep on getting updated signatures, just like antivirus. So vulnerability assessments, they look for known signatures. Automated tools will produce a lot of false positives. And not that these aren't vulnerabilities, but they might not be truly exploitable. So they're just a start for you. You need to do an actual penetration test, ethical hacking, to determine if the vulnerabilities that are discovered can truly be compromised. You do have to realize that some vulnerability scanners are more aggressive than others and can potentially destabilize a fragile system or certainly interfere with normal operations. So that's our overview of vulnerability scanning.